So I titled this chapter "Weather the Storm." We've heard that phrase before, I imagine. You guys know what it means to weather the storm. What would you say that means when you hear that?
Just, keep going. Don't let it stop you. And make it through.
Yeah.
Prepare yourself for the worst.
Right.
Beware possibly the worst.
Stay strong during the hard times.
Right, during a hard time, difficult times is what we're talking about when we say it, right? The storm in Acts 27 is quite literally a storm, but obviously this is an idiom that we use today when we say weather the storm for talking about difficult times in life to get through. But we're going to look at this chapter of what Paul goes through as he literally weathers the storm in chapter 27 of Acts. Last week, we pretty much dedicated the whole lesson to fulfilled prophecy. We discussed how Paul fulfilled 6 prophecies that were just written in chapter 6 of Acts alone. And we also looked at excerpts from Peter Stoner's book, Science Speaks, which examined 8 Old Testament prophecies, very specific prophecies in which Jesus fulfilled. We learned that the odds of their fulfillment was generally around 1 in 10 to the 17th power, which is an infinitesimal number. The way we quantify that, or the way he did in his book, was saying that if you covered the state of Texas 2 feet deep with silver dollars, and you marked one of those silver dollars and you mixed it in the mix all throughout Texas, and you were blindfolded and were told to go pick a silver dollar, the odds of actually picking that marked silver dollar was 1 in 10 to the 17th power, the same as Jesus fulfilling 8 Old Testament prophecies. It's very, very amazing. It's basically miraculous, and it's more miraculous to think that Jesus fulfilled basically like 350 Old Testament prophecies, which is just unfathomable. Acts 27 starts with Paul still as a prisoner in Caesarea. He's basically been arrested since Acts 21, where he was talking in the temple and he got arrested there. He was charged for teaching against the Jews, for teaching against the law, for teaching against the temple, and for the false accusation of bringing a Gentile into the temple. Those were the accusations made back in Acts 21. And right now, he is basically still paying for that almost basically 2 years later. He was almost killed in the temple when the Asian Jews were going after him for the accusations, and he was basically rescued by being arrested. The Roman soldier, centurion, arrested him and basically rescued him from what would have been certain death. And that's when he became a prisoner, way back then. So Festus becomes the governor after 2 years. He asks Paul if he wants to get tried again in Jerusalem, and he says, no, I want to appeal to Caesar, which means that he does not want to stand trial in Jerusalem. He wants to go to Rome to make his case before Caesar. Okay? Paul's appeal for Caesar means that now he has to be brought from Caesarea to Rome. So in this chapter, this is what we're looking at. We're looking at Paul's voyage from being a prisoner in Caesarea and how he ends up going on the route to Rome. This chapter, interestingly enough, in secular history, this chapter heavily influences what our historians and our intellectuals know about first century sailing and shipping and trade routes throughout the Mediterranean, because there's a lot of detail in here about what they were doing when they were navigating the sea during this rough time. So they get a lot of information from it, and we can get a lot of information from it too, obviously. So some objectives for today is we're going to identify the reason why Paul was on a ship going to Italy. I already actually told you why he was on a ship going to Italy. We'll identify the things which we must build our life upon in order for us to weather the storms. These are things that Jesus says. We'll identify the evidence which supports the story of Paul's shipwreck in Acts 27, because there is evidence of an actual shipwreck that is similar to what Paul went through, that they have found. Starting in the beginning, verse 1 of Acts 27. And when it was decided that we should set sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship from Adramyttium, which was about to set sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. All right, so this is the first ship Paul boards, and it's going to sail on the mainland towards Asia. If you see the map there, it's basically going to go up the coast and under that land shelf there between the island of Cyprus and Cilicia and Pamphylia. That's the route they're going to take. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and to be cared for. Okay, this is a little interesting note here that Paul, a prisoner, is entrusted with some liberties by the Roman centurion. We know that it would have been significantly punished if you lose a prisoner in Rome. Like, he would have paid for it with his life, probably, or with whatever the punishment would have been for the prisoner he lost. So if Paul's facing the punishment of death, well, then he would have been put to death also if you lose a prisoner. Here he's entrusting Paul to go and be treated for by his friends. It doesn't mention any Roman escorts going with him, but there very could have been Roman soldiers escorting him to his friends. We just know that he had some liberties to go and visit with his friends in the area of Sidon. That was the first stop on the trip. And putting out to sea, from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us aboard. All right, so the journey has been some rough sailing so far, as you can see the route that they took. And now they're switching their ships. They're getting off the ship that they're on and they're taking another ship, which is from Alexandria, and that ship is going to take them to Italy. If you notice that Luke has now included himself in the journey too. He's saying we all the time rather than they or he, you know. So apparently Luke is on this trip too. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off of Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. Coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lacia. All right. Fair Havens. I mean, it sounds like a really nice resort village to me, actually, like something place that would probably be up in the Poconos with a golf course on it where you'd go honeymoon at, you know what I mean? These are Fair Havens. So that's where they are. And it turns out not to be such a great place. It's for spending the winter. It's not a great place for them to leave their ship in the water. So they're going to try to go to the nearby port of Phoenix, if you see it there. That's their next move, is they're just going to go about 40 miles away on the same island to another port. That's the intention here. Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast, which is a Day of Atonement or Yom Kippur as we know it, was already over. Paul advised them saying, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." So when Paul points out that it was after the fast, or Luke points it out, he's letting us know that this is early fall, or around this has to be after like September, October, after the fast. So you're in the fall months. Paul speaks up here. He gives his advice to the captain saying that we shouldn't leave. Now, remember, who is Paul, right? He's a prisoner on his boat. Do you think the ship's captain and anybody on the ship, like the centurion, are going to listen to him? No, right? They're not going to listen to some prisoner on a ship telling them what to do. They're sea captains. They can know that they can make it only 40 miles to Phoenix. So the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there. Here's your majority. Here's your democracy. This is what democracy gets you into trouble, because we are a republic. Just saying, there is a distinct difference. So the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they would reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. All right, so you see I put Phoenix on the map here. You can see very very clearly that it doesn't look like it's all that hard to do to get from Fair Havens to Phoenix, okay? So these sea captains really think that this is a plausible trip. They're gonna go for it, all right? There's a tiny little island, you'll see it underneath to the left there, that is mentioned in the next part. Now, when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called a northeaster came down from the land and it blew on them, right? So it blew them off course. They were just trying to go to Phoenix. This north wind comes down upon them and blows them south away from Phoenix. When the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along, running under the lee of a small island, Cauda, where we managed to, with difficulty, to secure the ship's boat. All right, so you see that small island is showing up here. They ended up off route going past this tiny little island. They're heading out into the open waters, and they can't prevent it from happening. The winds are too strong that are bearing down on them, and they're getting pushed out into the open sea of the Mediterranean Sea. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on Syrtis, they lowered the gear, which is a sea anchor, and thus they were driven along. Since they were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. Okay, so you got a lot of information in here about what they would do during storms. They're saying that they would undergird the ship, which is apparently a way of sending down some strips underneath the ship to kind of like tighten up all the boards under it. Okay, they would undergird the ship to make it more secure so it doesn't fall apart. They had this sea anchor, which is basically a drag in the back of the boat. If you ever seen drag racing, when they go and they get across the finish line, a parachute comes out at the end and it slows them down. That's the idea of here, what's at the back of the ship. It's some sort of like a sail in the water to slow the ship down so they don't just get pushed into some land. Yeah, it was to slow them down. Apparently this wind must have been super strong, was pushing them too fast that they didn't know where they would end up. They couldn't see, they didn't know where they were going. They had to slow the ship down. They also jettisoned the cargo. What does that mean, to jettison the cargo? I think they were throwing it overboard. They were tossing the cargo off the ship to lighten the ship. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us. All hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. All right, so next day things are really bad. They throw the ship's tackle overboard. All the boating tools like the ropes and extra sails or any other items that are useful for the trip are just tossed overboard. So they really must have feared sinking, trying to keep this boat afloat, make it as light as possible so it floats better. The sky is dark, they can't see, the clouds are covering the stars, they have no idea where they're going because that's what they used to navigate, right? They didn't have GPS back then to know where they were, they had to use the stars. So if you can't see the stars and you're in the middle of open waters, good luck trying to find out what direction you're traveling or where you're heading. They didn't know where they were going. As they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship." Okay. This, could be taken as Paul basically telling them, "I told you so," right? And I don't think he's doing that. It's obviously they're more of a dire situation than anything before, and he's being totally serious here. Like, you should have listened to me, and they really should have. Obviously he's touched by God. He's one of God's holy people. He has a connection to the Almighty, and they should have listened to him.
Yeah, but he's a prisoner.
Yeah, but he's a prisoner. But he knows things. They didn't listen, and now they're fearing for their life. Now they don't know what's happening. They have no hope. They're afraid, And Paul's giving them words of encouragement. He's saying, listen, there's not going to be any loss of life among you. And these words must have lifted their spirits, at least, to help them to have a little bit of hope in the idea that they weren't going to die. The boat might be lost, but they weren't going to die. For this very night there stood before me an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I've been told. But we must run aground on some island. Okay, so Paul has another spiritual encounter with a spiritual being, an angel of the Lord, an angel of Yahweh, who told him not to be afraid because it's God's will that he stand before Caesar. So it's part of God's providential plan that they go through this storm. They're going through this storm because God has set these things in motion. And this is how God works. And it's how God works in Paul's life at this very moment, as we see here. Paul is literally going through the storm with everybody on the ship. It's a violent storm, a scary storm. These seasoned seafarers, these pilots and captains, they're afraid. Everybody's afraid. And Paul's fortunate because the Lord appears to him, lets him know how it's going to end in the end. So they can have faith in that. Paul's in a literal storm, and literal storms can be terrifying. Has anybody here been afraid during a storm? Tell me about it. Why would you be afraid during a storm, like a literal storm?
I don't know. I mean, depends where you are.
Right. So if you're afraid during a storm, why would you be afraid?
No, in their case, where they were.
Right, but in our case, if we've ever been afraid, because we don't know what's going to happen, right? Because when you're in a storm, you don't know how it's going to end. Are you still going to have a roof over your head? Will your walls cave in? Will windows break? I'm talking about in our own lives. If you're in like a literal storm, even today, like we just had a snowstorm recently last week, who knew how it was going to end? I mean, we are not as afraid when we're on ground in a home where we feel secure. But if you started to hear the walls cracking and glass breaking, you start to be very fearful about where it's going. What's that?
She's afraid every time the wind blows.
Yeah, probably.
Well, but I watched that black thing.
Outside? Yeah. Well, that's it. I mean, we don't know. When we're going through a literal storm, we're quite honestly in the hands of God and his mercy. Like if he's going to have mercy on us or not, if the storm's going to bring destruction on us or not, we do not know how it ends. Fortunately, Paul knew how it was going to end in this case. Paul was told that
he had seen something that we only told about
right.
to Jesus and the apostles.
So he was able to be more confident in what was happening to them because he knew that God appeared to him and said, it's going to be okay. This is what has to take place. And as we discussed a little bit earlier, the idea of weathering the storm or going through a storm is a metaphor for going through a difficult time in life. You may hear that people, use that phrase sometimes, that they have to go through the storm, they have to weather the storm or get through a storm. And they're not talking about a literal storm, they're talking about a figurative storm. And we've all had storms in our life. Before I continue in Acts 27, I just wanted to share with you basically the way storms can work and how a storm worked in my life to bring me to Christ, right? It wasn't a literal storm. It's the idea of going through something that's a difficult time. And the most difficult time was not a time for me. It was a time for, a friend of the family, for Tracy and Michael and their son, Brendan, when it was, started in 2006, when he was diagnosed with cancer. And I remember because Tracy called me early in the morning, and it might have been March, around his birthday, in 2006. And she says to me that her son has cancer. And she's afraid to tell mom, or hesitant to tell mom, because she knows she's going to be really upset. And she did feel like she could even speak the words. Yeah, that's right. You were pregnant with Randy during that time, and it would have been very upsetting to you. So she tells me so that I could relay the message in a different, not such a direct way. So that was the start of their storm, and it endured for them for a little over a year with him. He was in and out of the ER regularly. There were a lot of lengthy hospitalization stays where they had to be in a hospital, and their other two young kids had to be cared for. And for the time of almost 2 years, like you just said, they were juggled from house to house or family to family in order to be watched and cared for throughout that time. At about 2.5 years old, we got news that he wasn't going to make it through the night. So, Jennifer and I were invited up to the hospital to sit with the family, and that's, where we were when he died with them. And it was November 19th, 2007, when he died. And that's when I realized that, like, what I had known up until that point of what occurs at death, or what about God, and the information that I had was all very, it lacked any substance. It didn't hold any weight. I couldn't speak words of wisdom to them. I couldn't speak words of encouragement to them. I didn't know really what happened or where he went, or what happens when people die in a storm like this. And that's what happened to them. I mean, basically, they were going through this storm, and we were part of this storm, going through this with them, affected by it indirectly, and they were directly affected by it in that they lost their son. So through that, like I said, God brought me safely out of that to a place where I began to search for God, and that was the start of 2008, like January 2008, right afterwards, when I got serious about looking towards finding out what is true, because that ultimately became all that was important to me. I didn't care where the road led, so long as it led to a place of what is true. So I didn't rule out any religions, and I did explore many religions. I'm not just talking Christian denominations, I'm talking other religions, right? I looked at like Islam and Buddha and whatever else was out there that was popular. I did take a quick look at them, and I quickly discarded all them, because there is no substance to them when you get right down to it. When you examine their origins and where their scriptures come from, and what it all entails, they leave you hopeless and without a firm foundation of what is true. So it was very easy to fall into looking at Christianity again. And when I was doing a Bible study with Bob Carr at the Long Island Church, he took the time to teach me the Bible very well, and it became really clear to me just how substantially true the Bible is. How everything builds upon it within the Bible. It's not just some random book like the other ones with some random ramblings of a single man. This is 66 books all interwoven to tell a single story, and it begins with the genesis of God, with it in the beginning, with the genesis of the earth, and then all the way up until the time of the Israelites and what they were going through in the time of Jesus. So I did the studies with him. It was only 12 online studies, and I can share them with anybody who wants them, if anybody wants to go through them with me. And it taught me a lot, but I still wasn't sure now what I was dealing with in terms of this church. Like, what is this, like a cult or something? So let me examine other things still. So I did, and I exhausted all the other options out there. I went through all the different denominations and looked at what they taught, and everything had something that was obviously false about them. So I discarded and cut aside many of those, all of them rather. And at some point, it was a year later that I said, all right, I'm going to go visit Bob at his church. It's kind of miraculous, actually, because we met online. I didn't know where he was, and he invited me to his church. And I was like, I don't even know where you are. You could be anywhere in the world. This is the internet, right? So he's like, oh, we're in Islip. I was like, oh, okay. That's right where I am. So it was very hard to say, oh, I can't make it there. I was not going to be able to get there when it's, within the same area. So a year later, I did go to that church, and I remember walking in and being welcomed there more than I've been welcomed anywhere before. And from that point on, I've just stayed the course, you know, through my growth of holding fast to what is true. And it's, like I said, it's because of that storm that I went through, that others went through, that I was a part of, that we experienced together, that something came out of it that was good for me in my life and opening my eyes about God and the kingdom of God. It taught me the distinctions between the worldly kingdom, which I was a part of, and the heavenly kingdom, which I crossed over, you know, when I had to cross over this threshold in baptism into a heavenly kingdom, into a new land, being born again, you know, being washed of my sins is where I ended up. And when you go through a storm in life, I'd say to try to be mindful that though the storm is hard and though it's scary, that God's will is being done in the storms that you're going through, because you will go through them. You know, whether or not you lay here and you're not thinking about anything, or you're just, you know, zoning out, you will have troublesome times in your life, and you will need this to get through it. We may not understand it and we may not see it, but we should be aware of it and trust in Him that there is deliverance in the end of a storm that we're going through, though maybe not for us. Even if it means the death of us, it has deliverance for somebody else. All right, sometimes God's will is advanced exponentially through a storm, just like Jesus's death. Jesus faced the ultimate storm, right? When he was put up on that cross and crucified, and, you know, in a horrible, horrible manner, the way he went through, you know, so his death, burial, and resurrection, through that storm, the whole world has changed. It's changed so drastically that we actually live in a country that's founded on his teachings, and we don't really comprehend life before the cross, like what it must have been like for everybody living in that world. And we have the truth of Jesus, which has shaped the world we actually live in. So if we are in Christ, built on his foundations, then we can stand and be delivered through the storm. When we believe him, trust him, and obey him, just as it's written in Matthew 7:24. It says, everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and they beat on that house. But it did not fall, because it was founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does them, does not do them, will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. Now, you don't need to build your house on the rock of Jesus's word in order to live in this world and have a fun worldly life. But when the storms in life do come, and they will come, then you will have nothing to fall back on. You will have nothing to support you. You will not have the knowledge or the wisdom to share with those who are in the storm with you in order to encourage them or help them through it. So to weather the storms in life, you must build your house, your life, your character on him and his words. Your actions in life must be based on his teachings. As he says, you are to hear his words and do them, right? Not just pray, not just fast, not just think about them, but you hear him and you do them. And then you'll be built, as he says, upon a rock. And when the storm comes, you will be able to endure the storm and be a blessing to those who are around you. And when you go through the storm, you will be able to endure. All right? Just like Paul had to endure the quite literal storm he's going through. And it's time for us to rejoin him on his journey. When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther, they took a sounding again and found it 15 fathoms. All right. So again, we have more information here. They spent 14 nights at sea in a boat, right? A big ship with about 270 other people. It's a massive storm. It drove them about the sea. They didn't have any control over their ship. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know where they were. It was dark. The sailors suspected that they were nearing land. And I don't know how they knew that since it was dark. I don't know how they suspected that they were nearing land, except probably from their experiences that they've had in the past. Maybe they could hear the sound of waves crashing on a shore somewhere to make them think. They certainly would be more in tune to it than I am. You know what I mean? So that could have been what they were relying on their hearing or in their intuition. So they take a sounding, which means that they lower a rope with a weight on it. They lower it to the bottom of the seafloor, and then they pull it up again, and they measure the rope to see how deep the water is. The first time they did that, they found out it was about 120 feet deep, saying it's 20 fathoms. And then the second time they find out it's about 90 feet deep. So they realize that they're getting closer to shallower, waters, which means the land is probably getting closer to the ship. Fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. All right. So they can't see the land. They don't know where it is, but they know they're getting close. So they're afraid that they're going to get smashed up on the rocks by the land. So it's nighttime still, so they just decide to lay down 4 anchors off the back of the boat and anchor their boat to the seafloor so that they don't move any closer to the rocks until they can see the sunrise and know where they're at. So Paul notices now that some sailors are trying to get into the lifeboat. It looks like they're probably trying to free themselves or save themselves or something. And he sends this report to the centurion, telling him that if the men left the ship, that he cannot be saved. Now, this is a little side note, but is this something we need to do to be saved? I just find it interesting because it's the same term used here, that saved is the same term we see, like, you must confess with your mouth in order to be saved. So you have this idea that if you want to just pull scripture out of context, somebody could use this scripture and be like, see, unless you stay in the boat, you won't be saved, which is obviously foolishness. This is what happened on that boat at that time when Paul was talking to the centurion. He needed everybody to stay in that boat.
No, but obviously, they had enough respect for Paul
Well, at this point, yeah,
at this point.
Sure.
And listen to him, and he's done right.
So
if they would have forced him or to go further, because
Mhm.
they feel, and I'm sure who he is. He's got a
Yeah,
deep
he's got a,
vision from God.
he did, right.
Yeah, and so that they trust him, they believe in him, that he had a spiritual canopy.
Right. Now, I find it interesting because he does say that they, to the centurion, everybody must be in the boat to be saved. And it is similar actually to what we must do, right? In order for us to be saved, we must be in Christ. Okay, now it's not a ship, but it is a similar thing, right? If we're not in Christ, we're not in the right way. We're not listening to it. Like if they would have doubted and be like, no, we don't need to be in the boat, just let them go. They wouldn't have been saved. I'm confident about that. So we must be in Christ. So anyway, the soldiers, with the boat that they were letting out, they were going to get on that little lifeboat, and the soldiers cut away the boat so that the sailors couldn't take that little lifeboat to the shore. Yep, they just cut it away. So now they're on a ship which doesn't have a lifeboat, and they know they're about to get wrecked. At some point, they're gonna wreck on the land. This is what Paul had told them that God revealed to them. And they don't have a lifeboat. So here we go. As day was about to dawn, which they know that the sun's about to rise now, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And that must have been encouraging too. Like, here we go. We're going to get some food, and then we're going to see what happens next to get off this boat. When he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they all were encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship throwing out the wheat into the sea, right? So they didn't eat in 14 days. The sun's beginning to rise. Paul knows that they need energy in order to swim to the shore. So he encourages them to eat some bread. He gives them bread. He breaks the bread. He gives thanks to God, and they begin to eat. And just as like a side note, he didn't give thanks to Zeus or Jupiter or any of these other gods that they would have been worshiping. He gave thanks to Yahweh for where they were and what they were doing. All right, so he's giving thanks to the food, for the food that they have on the ship, even though they haven't eaten in 14 days. The storm is still, I think, unrelenting, still coming down on them, but it shows that, you know, that Paul had this faith in God, this hope in God, and this trust of God, this love of God, that he would, you know, pray and break bread with them in such a way, knowing that they are going to be delivered.
I don't think we can even imagine the power that this man had with these people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, with the charisma that he created within them.
I think that they really had no choice. You know, when like they're facing certain death, and this is the only man uttering words of hope and wisdom.
And
That's who you gravitate to.
he obviously had a charisma to give them the feeling that this man knows it.
Oh yeah,
You know,
but I don't know if it was charisma is the right word. I mean, he had the abundance of truth on his side. Like anything he said is coming true. So they're trusting in him now as they see, like he's obviously touched by God.
Yeah, listen to this man.
Right.
You get something special that we don't have.
I mean, and they trust him so much that they throw the wheat overboard. That's where the money was for them. All right, this was a shipping vessel. That was their primary like cargo that they were going to sell and make money at, and they just throw it overboard. So they know with some level of certainty that the ship's going to sink anyway, and the wheat's going to end up in the water anyway, and this is what's going to happen. So they're just trying to lighten the ship as much as possible, right? So that when they get close to land, if the ship's light or it's up higher, they can get as close as possible to the shoreline without having to swim as far as they would if it was down lower, right? Just makes sense. So they lighten it up as much as possible, and they're going to run the ship aground. Now, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then, hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. All right, so they see the beach now. They know where they want to get to. So they just basically cut the anchors and they leave them in the sea. Those 4 anchors, those ancient anchors, they should either still be on the sea floor or at some point in history recovered from the sea floor. Those things, if found, would bring a substantial amount of evidence or testimony to this story being true. And either they should still be in the water or they should have been found by now. And we'll see. If they're found, in order for this story to be corroborated, they should be found in water that's about 90 feet deep. That was the last time they took a sounding, and then they dropped the anchor. And it should be near a beach, right? And that should all be testimony to this story being true. We'll have a little more on that later. And striking a sandbar, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf that was smashing upon it. And the soldiers, the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. Like I said, if they lost a prisoner, it would have meant certain death for them. So they don't want to risk it. They'd rather just kill their prisoners. The centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out that plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to the land. Okay. The soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners. like I said, because if they lost a prisoner, it would end in their death. The centurion wanted to save Paul, so he stopped that from happening. And instead, they all end up arriving safely on the land, on an island. If for some strange reason, maybe some of you guys went to chapter 28 already, and you could have found out what island it was. Does anybody know what island they actually land on? It would be a wild guess, right? It's called Malta, okay? You can see it on this map here, and you can see generally the route that they took. Malta is a tiny island south of Italy. It is mentioned in chapter 28, so that's for certain where they were. When they found out what island they were on, it was Malta.
What's that big landmass between Italy and Malta?
That's, I think, Sicily. All right?
Sicily's not in Italy?
It's part of it. It's just an island off it.
Long Island is, United States.
All right, so I want you to watch now this video on
It was sometime around 60 AD, and the Apostle Paul was en route to Rome from the Isle of Crete. On the journey, a fierce storm blew the ship off course.
On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. They took soundings and found the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea.
With the storm still raging, the ship struck a sandbar and began to break apart. The nearly 300 men on board swam for their lives. Miraculously, everyone survived.
Once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta.
And so began a Christian influence in Malta that has continued down through the centuries. Today, Malta is Europe's most religious nation. 98% of its citizens are Catholic. St. Paul is memorialized across the island, nowhere more than in St. Paul's Bay, where tourists come to visit the shipwrecked cathedral and see the spot where most believe Paul's ship ran aground nearly 2,000 years ago. But when former Los Angeles crime scene investigator Bob Cornuke paid a visit to Malta, facts in the biblical narrative didn't fit with the view from St. Paul's Bay. That difference led to a 10-year search for the true location of Paul's shipwreck. Bob started in the pages of his Bible. The crux of the story revolved around the 4 anchors. Could they be found?
And I looked at the Bible and said, could I solve this like it was a crime? Could I take the evidence that exists on the pages of the Bible and actually find these lost anchors that the Bible talks about?
Acts 27 and 28 gives a very detailed account, so Bob listed 4 factors that would have to match up in order to find the true location. A bay with a beach, a reef with a sandbar where 2 seas meet, the seabed at about 90 feet of depth, and a place the sailors would not have recognized. Cornuke enlisted the help of a group of men who know the waters around Malta best, the Maltese fishermen.
So what I did is I started my search by going out with these fishermen that knew the weather, knew the currents, knew the topography of the ocean. They took me out with them and they explained to me all the possible places based on what the Bible narrative says to where the shipwreck of Paul could have been.
Most of Malta is surrounded by cliffs, so Bob quickly narrowed down the possibilities to a few bays with beaches. To figure out which site was most plausible, Cornuke looked to Dr. Graham Hutt, an expert on Mediterranean storms.
I've been studying the storms and the weather patterns in the Mediterranean over the past 30 years, and it resulted in a book on North Africa and Malta, which covers all these issues with the weather.
Dr. Hutt's expertise helped make sense of the clues in Acts.
They were really scared of getting dragged down into the Bay of Sirte, down on the Libyan coast, so they would have been trying as much as they could to head in a northerly direction, but only actually making northwesterly.
The only bay in that area that fits the direction of drift Bob calculated is called the Bay of St. Thomas.
In my opinion, bearing in mind where they most probably would have been, St. Thomas's Bay is a much more likely place.
We're just coming into St. Thomas Bay on the southeastern side of Malta, and the theory goes that this was the bay that was written about in Acts 27 and 28. Now, part of the biblical account says that the sailors didn't recognize the island and didn't know where they were until the villagers told them that this was Malta. And that is another support for the theory that this was the bay that they landed in, because if the sailors had landed on the north side of the island, there were many ports that they should have been familiar with. One day, Bob made an electrifying discovery. It came by way of an old diver with an incredible story.
I met a man named Ray Chancho, and he said, "Hey, Bob, in the late 60s and early 70s, we dug up 4 anchors from the ocean bottom at about 90 feet depth."
The location? Just outside St. Thomas Bay, near a dangerous sandbar called the Moonshar Reef. The anchors were later donated to the National Maritime Museum. An expert analysis confirmed that they were from the Roman era, but the divers had no idea what they had at the time.
We found the anchors at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. I wouldn't remember the exact year, you know. As I say, it was of no importance to me whatsoever when we found them. It was, yippee, we found a piece of lead.
Ray agreed to show us the area where the anchors were found. Coming out to the head of Moonshar Reef. We're going to dive down and see if we can find the site where the anchors were brought up.
So when I went out and looked at the location where they found these anchors, I looked at the shoreline and it fit with what the Bible said. There was a bay with a beach. There was a reef where 2 seas come together.
Today, the seafloor is again tranquil and calm, giving no clues to the secrets that lie beneath the waves. It's impossible to know for sure if this is the spot where Paul's shipwreck occurred, but many Maltese are intrigued by the theory. Joe Navarro is another of the divers who helped retrieve the anchors.
I myself am convinced that it is more plausible that the shipwreck was on Moonshar, not on St. Paul's Island. We have believed St. Paul's Island, but nobody ever sort of questioned, but are you sure?
We looked down at this glistening anchor, and I remember kneeling down and putting my hand on that cold object and thinking that I could be now touching history. For 2,000 years it belonged to the sea, and now I was actually touching this object that could come to us from the pages of the Bible.
Today, the anchors are tucked away in a corner of Valletta's Maritime Museum. Most visitors pass them by, having no idea what history they might hold. Chuck Holton, CBN News, on the Mediterranean Isle of Malta.
So isn't that super interesting?
Pretty crazy one. Actually,
So they just found that in this generation, right?
the 60s.
Late 60s, early 70s, they come across these 4 anchors in about 90 feet of water in a reef outside of, Malta, on the south side of Malta, where they would have been coming up, and it all just adds up way too nicely.
Red Catholic tub is.
No, it's in a museum. It's in a secular museum. So, you can go see it anytime there. But,
Sounds pretty cool.
all right. So going back now to our learning objectives, let's see. I don't want to give you the answer. Why was Paul on a ship going to Italy, Greg? Was he A, on a cruise ship to vacation in Rome? B, was he a prisoner and forced to stand trial in Rome? C, Paul appealed to Caesar and preferred to stand trial in Rome rather than in Jerusalem. And Paul was going on his 4th missionary journey. D. C. Yes, Paul appealed to Caesar and preferred to stand trial in Rome rather than the Jews in Jerusalem who would have killed him anyway. All right. So according to Jesus, when the storms of life come, what do we need to do to rely? What do we need to rely on in order to weather the storm? A, in order to weather the storm, we must fast. B, in order to weather the storm, we must hear the words of Jesus and do them. C, in order to weather the storm, we must pray. Or D, in order to weather the storm, we must obey our government. Brandon? Right. In order to weather the storm, we must hear the words of Jesus and do them. Now, what evidence supports the story of Paul's shipwreck in Acts 27? A, that there is a sandbar on the south side of Malta that's about 90 feet below water. B, that there is a beach where two seas meet. C, that they found 4 ancient anchors off the coast of Malta. Or D, all of the above. D, all of the above. All right. Very good. And now you have a lot of more information regarding Paul in the book of Acts. And next week is Acts 28. Acts 28 is the final chapter of the book of Acts. Paul will finally arrive in Rome, and we need to discuss where we're going to go from there. Well, what books we might like to go through next.